Hello, this is Dorothy Richmond, and I'm an 88-year-old lady who loves stories. This is the first story I ever wrote down. Several people in my family have asked me over the years to do that, and so I want to share it with you. It's called Delilah, and my mother heard it when she was an 8-year-old girl. It was just after the noon meal. The cooking fires had been stirred out, and the scouts were just mounting up. The lazy movement and creaking of the wagon was lulling Delilah into a happy stupor. Her pallet was right behind the folks, Mama and Papa, and she watched the harness lines sway as she listened to Mama hum to baby brother. Delilah knew that as soon as Mama got him to sleep, he would join her on the pallet on the flat trunk. It had a cozy stack of quilts. Some of the wagons were being pulled by oxen, and the wagons were moving very slowly. They didn't stir up any dust. Then there was a sound she had never heard before, a loud screeching and yipping sound, like 100 coyotes all at once. It was so sudden, and it didn't stop. She saw men pulling on the lines to the horses. They jerked and reared up, and Delilah slid off the trunk. She saw a man's open mouth as he reached up to take the baby out of Mama's arms. The man held the baby in one hand by his bare feet, whirled him over his head, and rammed him into a big tree. He just dropped the baby there and went running toward another wagon. Delilah could see her mother trying to climb over the wagon wheel, and then she couldn't see Papa or Mama anymore. Everyone was screaming, even the horses. Something made her stay still, and the awful noises went on for quite a while. Then it got very quiet, and she stepped out of the back of the wagon and stumbled over to the tree where her baby brother was laying all crumpled up. She gathered up her pinafore apron and tried to pick up her brother's brains. Everywhere around there were dead people, people she had just shared lunch with. The Indians had attacked on foot, but they led away all the horses. The wagon tongues were strange looking, straps of leather tangled in a heap on them, and there were two big piles, one of metal things like shovels and copper water tubs, and another of quilts and clothing and canvas from the wagons. While she was standing there in a stupor, a voice she recognized from the wagon train came up to her and said, "We're the only two alive. We've got to get out of here. They'll be back." Delilah pulled away from him and said, "I can't leave my folks out there for wild animals to drag away." He explained that he'd been walking alongside the wagon. He was gathering firewood for his mother. When he heard the screaming, he knew there was nothing he could do, so he just waited until the Indians left with the horses. He told Delilah the Indians wouldn't have taken time to make the piles unless they intended to come back for them. He tried to help her dig a grave, but they hadn't finished when the Indians came back and caught them. Delilah was 7 and the boy was 9. Once they got to the settlement, they were never allowed to talk to each other, and they were slaves to the Indian families on opposite sides of the settlement. These Indians didn't travel. They raised crops, and the men went on hunting and raiding trips. One of Delilah's jobs was to fetch water from a spring up the hill from the settlement, and she took care of the children and helped dig for roots and picked up nuts. She learned what the Indians ate, and when her clothes wore out, she wore what they wore. No one called her by her name anymore, and she didn't learn what the boy's name was. She forgot what her last name was. When the Indians got firewater, even the grandmothers drank it. One summer night, the whole village had been drinking, and some of the men lay in a drunken stupor. Several were still throwing up. Most of the children and older folks were asleep, but Delilah was still cleaning smelly messes. Even some of the dogs had been vomited on. Delilah had been to the spring several times, but this time she approached it very carefully because there was a torch stuck in its sandy bottom. When she got close, the boy spoke to her in English and said, "This is a chance for us to get away because everyone was drunk or asleep, and the Indians never left the village at night." That's true. He had stashed some meat and grain in a leather pouch. So they just left the torch burning so it looked like someone was still there. And then they followed the creek as far as they could before the sun came up. The boy explained that they would hide all day and then move again when it got dark. He helped Delilah scoot feet first into a hollowed tree trunk which lay close to the sandy creek bank. He warned her not to move all day, no matter what. He talked about climbing a tree and said that if he got captured, he wouldn't tell where she was, and if she got caught, she mustn't tell where he was. Delilah was 9 years old by then because they lived with the Indians for 2 years. Some of them had been quite mean to her. As she lay there, she wondered what would happen to the Indian babies she took care of. She tried to remember what her parents' names were, but it had been a long time and they were just Mama and Papa. As the sun got hotter, the insects began in the log began to crawl on her legs and even into her ears and face. She didn't dare scratch. It was mid-morning when she heard men and horses. Sure enough, they were looking for them. In fact, one of the horses stepped right over the log she was hiding in. She could see the foot of the rider. It was quiet the rest of the day, and when it got dark, she crawled out and softly called, "Where are you?" Nobody answered, and she never did see that boy again. She followed the creek all that night, hid in a tree the next night, and on the third day she heard a woman singing. There were no roads, but she came to the edge of a clearing and saw a man plowing between the stumps of some trees. He had used those trees to build a small cabin. When the dog barked at her, the man saw her and said, "Why, my goodness, child, whose little girl are you?" She didn't answer, just stood there staring at them. A woman was sitting in the shade churning butter in a tall wooden churn. Delilah saw a little child playing in the dirt, and there was a cow out back. Delilah was all scratched up, and her hair was tangled with burrs and sticks. The man noticed her Indian clothes and figured it out. He and his wife took her in, and she lived with them until she married. There's so much we'll never know about Delilah. Where did the wagon train start? Which group of Indians captured her? What was her last name? When did this happen? The people who took her in, who were they? And whatever happened to that boy? We'll never know. But Delilah is a true story that I cherish. It's part of our family. Thank you.